Hello, Happy New Year and welcome back to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Alasdair and in this episode I spoke to Dr. Oscar Berglund from Bristol University about climate activism and climate and environmental protests. Dr. Berglund is Senior Lecturer in International Public and Social Policy in the School for Policy Studies at Bristol, and he's recently published research, along with other colleagues, which you can find on our podcast blurb, on the criminalisation and repression of climate and environmental protests.
Our recommendation is really for people and institutions to see this as a threat to democracy and it's a threat to net zero policies as it is, and that it's been driven by the same actors that are against net zero.
I started our conversation by asking him to explain his research methods and the overall findings of the report.
I got interested in the criminalisation and repression of climate protests when the laws were coming in during the pandemic. What was a bill at that point in the UK, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, that is now the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, and that was then followed by the Public Order Act. This seemed to me to be a response to the climate movement that was very big and successful in 2018, 2019. And I had studied that movement, so it seemed to me to be an interesting, scary response to that movement with these new laws. And I discovered that, there were these new laws appearing in some countries, and I wanted to kind of understand why that was. So together with colleagues at the University of Bristol, we started to look into this, and we got a little bit of money to get a kind of research assistant to look into this. So we looked at both kind of qualitative data sets and quantitative data sets about climate protest and the policing of climate protest, and the qualitative data sets that has some of these new laws that have come about in some countries, and also other kinds of repression, other kinds of the way that states use existing laws and so on to repress protest. So this was carried out last year and culminated in the report that we released. And in this report, we basically identify 4 different ways that protest is criminalized and repressed, and particularly climate and environmental protest. So first of all, we distinguish between kind of climate protest and environmental protest. We say that climate protests are often in urban areas. They're specifically aimed at kind of climate change, climate policies, connected to groups like Fridays for Future, like Extinction Rebellion, and Just Stop Oil, any different kinds of groups that may be more or less disruptive, but that have the kind of clear climate focus. I mean, we distinguish that from environmental protest, which in a way has always existed, because environmental protest is about protecting your local environment. And obviously land defense has always existed. As long as industrialization, or even before it's existed, there's been powerful interests that want to change the way that land is used, and people that live and use that land oppose that and therefore try different means of defending that land. And that's what we kind of define as environmental interests. Now, often these environmental protection and environmental activism can also be climate activism. If you're campaigning against stopping, a fossil fuel project because it interferes with where you live, then, you're also arguably a climate activist. So they're not entirely separate, but we nonetheless have these 2 different forms that this takes, because, as I say, one is much older and one is a kind of newer phenomenon. But also one takes place in cities and one takes place away from the eyes of the media and so on. And that seemed to us like it could maybe be open to more repression and more violent repression. So we were interested in that distinction. But we then identified 4 different ways that the climate and environmental protest is criminalized or repressed. So the main one that got us to look at it is new laws that limit the way that protests can take place. Some of these new laws bring in punishment for new crimes that weren't previously punishable. They bring in longer sentences or ways to police protests that weren't previously allowed by the police. And these new laws are common in Australia, the UK, several other countries. You've got in the US. In many countries, they are kind of still being discussed or proposed, but haven't necessarily been voted through by parliament. And then if that's the kind of first form of repression, then the second form of repression that we identify is the criminalisation through prosecutions or courts. So using the legal system to criminalise or repress climate and environmental protesters. So that can be done by using existing laws. So that's often anti-terror laws that has been used in countries from Germany to the Philippines. So very much something that process goes across the global north and south. Or laws that are intended to be used against organized crime organizations. So that was a thing in Spain and also in Germany. Then also, bring in more cases to the courts. So traditionally, in many countries, there's been a kind of allowance of protest, as in like you understand that, well, okay, these actors are part of the political system in a way. Like there's a certain legitimacy to protest climate and environmental destruction. But that kind of tolerance is decreasing. So like basically more cases are being brought to courts and judges are using more harsher sentencing. So, there's a range of sentencing that can be handed out and there's, more going for longer sentences. So you saw that last year in the UK with some really long sentences, up to 4 and 5 years in one case. And then the third kind is a very broad one, which is basically through policing. And policing is carried out by the state police, but it can also be carried out by armed forces, or it can be carried out by private companies, private security companies, or corporations kind of themselves. So policing can be anything from kind of stop and search. It can include arrests. It can include police violence or violence by security forces. It includes surveillance and it includes undercover kind of policing and infiltration, and that can be carried out by state forces or by private actors. And then the last kind, and obviously the most serious, is when that policing goes into killing protesters, right? So killing activists. And there, we rely on Global Witness data. So Global Witness has been monitoring and, cataloging killings of environmental defenders for some years now. So we use their data to support that. But if you look at those stories, then they are often preceded by the kind of things that we see in the policing category. And if you look at who carries out the killings, well, it's the same actors that carry out these other kinds of policing. So the surveillance and the threats and so on that then go on to do that. So you see different patterns there in the Global Witness data. So you see in some countries, it's the police that carry out the killings. In other countries, it's private actors, or in other countries, it's military. So one of the kind of key things that we say is that, well, the criminalisation and repression of climate and environmental protest is bad for two reasons, because it kind of happens instead of taking adequate action on climate change. So it's bad democratically, and it's also bad for the climate and environment, basically, because these people are there to fight for the climate and environment. And we're also saying that although there are obviously different patterns and different ways that this takes place in different places, a lot of these kinds of repression and criminalisation happen across the global north and global south. And we see forms of repression that is carried out in different kinds of contexts across that limit.
You say that the environmental protest is nothing new, but also that climate protests are actually relatively new in nature. Is what something that might be happening that you're picking up on general repression in terms of suppression of human rights and criminalisation of various political activities? And the fact is that climate protests are now a new political activity, and therefore that's kind of being picked up in what you have as a kind of generally there are many countries that tend to criminalise and suppress protest.
So these are in global south countries, but not poor global south countries primarily, right? It's the countries that are rich in natural resources, that have a lot of foreign direct investment. So it has a lot of Western-owned companies operating in these countries, but they often have questionable democracies, as in like it fluctuates the extent to how democratic these countries are. But if you look at the sort of where they rank in, the GDP, they are countries that are often within top GDP countries in the world. So they are not the poorest countries. And the countries that are high on these in sort of per capita terms are the Philippines, Brazil, Peru. Also, India have large absolute numbers, but probably lower per capita because they have such a huge population. So, ultimately, it's because climate protests come to be seen as a threat to corporate profits in a way that environmental protest always has been, because a company wants to do something which has a damaging effect on the local environment, and anybody protesting that stands in the way of the company making profit from that. The fact that urban climate protesters have been more targeted in this kind of new way of criminalization is because they are seen as a threat to corporate profits. Now, how? Arguably the 2018-2019 wave of protest changed a lot of the discourse in the public around climate change and around the urgency.
That includes, for example, in the UK, Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah, so in the UK, it includes Extinction Rebellion. Around the world, it's fair to say that Fridays for Future, sort of school strikes, had much bigger impact. If you look around the world, you have a myriad of groups in different countries that may have used more or less disruptive kinds of protest. But as a whole, that kind of wave of climate protest actually changed the way that climate change was talked about. That is now being attacked in many ways. I read in the news this morning about the Heartland Institute, who's a long-standing climate-denying think tank, or whatever you want to call it, from the US, that is now opening up basically offices in the UK, and where Liz Truss and Nigel Farage were invited to their, I read that piece in The Guardian this morning. So obviously there is a kind of wave of pushing climate denialism again now, because climate denialism went backwards when the climate movement was strong in 2019, 2020, right? Like that actually kind of sidelined climate change denialism. So those forces that have invested and, fossil fuel funded right-wing political forces that have funded and pushed for climate change denialism in order to make their profiteering easier, now push it back, but also criminalize the protesters that caused that. And that's the link that others have pointed out. So like journalists like Amy Westervelt, for example, in the US, has emphasized the links between fossil fuel companies and the repression of climate and environmental protesters. That link is there in some cases. In the UK, for example, we know that the Policy Exchange really pushed for these laws that we've had in the UK. And we know that Policy Exchange is part funded by fossil fuel companies. And we know that Policy Exchange was really close to the Conservative government that were before the current UK government. And in some other cases, we can also see that link. But what we can't say really, based on our research now, is that this is a kind of coordinated thing all around the world. Like it takes different patterns and different actors. Of course, in most cases, protesters are targeted because they do pose a risk to somebody's profits, right, to some corporate profits. But that's not always the fossil fuel industry. It can be, but it's not always. And it's not, we haven't seen any kind of huge evidence of coordination. It's something that we want to explore further. I'm inviting colleagues from Peru, Philippines and Australia to Bristol in February to hash out kind of what we want to research next, looking at these kind of countries as kind of good example countries where different kinds of criminalization and repression has taken place. What do we need to explore further to further understand this wave of criminalization and repression?
And I thought it was quite interesting that part of your report talks about criminalisation of protests being a way of depoliticising protest. Can you say just a little bit more about that before we go on to possible solutions?
Protesters are political actors. I mean, they're not elected political actors, but they are actors that act politically in a way that is different from being a member of a political party, right? But they seek to intervene in the political protest. They are not driven by self-interest in the way that we normally see most crimes in that sense are driven by kind of self-interest. Clearly, activism and, protest isn't. So when protest is criminalized in public discourses, in the media, or by politicians, or in the courts, it removes that kind of political agency, because being a political agent comes with a certain amount of legitimacy. Obviously, we are, as citizens, we should be able to intervene politically in our society. And doing so in a way that is not in self-interest carries a certain legitimacy. So when you remove that politics from it, and when you say, no, we don't care why you sat down and blocked a road, right? That's not important. What's important is that you just blocked a road. So we're not going to allow you to speak about climate change in this court, right? It's irrelevant. Obviously, climate change is relevant to why they sat on a road. It's relevant to their motivations. But so you remove that political agency, and that happens in many spheres. So it happens in the way that politicians speak about it, as I said. It happens the way that the media speaks about it, and it happens very kind of directly with direct consequences in courtrooms.
What are approaches which could reduce the criminalisation of protest or clamping down on protest and attacks on protesters?
I mean, if you look at countries, I mean, the UK and then the rest of Europe, the kind of direct action, civil disobedience protesters are really unpopular. So it's been kind of easy to mobilize support for these new laws and harsher punishments, because the protesters are unpopular. Now, these laws stretch way wider than just dealing with these few hundred protesters that people don't like. Our recommendation is really for people and institutions to see this as a threat to democracy, and it's a threat to net zero policies as it is, and that it's been driven by the same actors that are against net zero. To take this threat seriously and to reverse the criminalisation and repression of these actors, to recognise them as legitimate political actors, that you might not necessarily agree with the means that they take and the methods that they use, all of them, but that they are legitimate political actors and that they should be treated as such.
When you talk about the kind of relative unpopularity of protesters, I think it's quite a good way to move into some of your other research, which has been around the effectiveness of climate protests and the impacts of climate protests. You cited opinion polls in Germany and the UK saying that there was, a very small sample of the population was actually supportive of the most recent climate protests. So some of the German ones. Could you say something more about the relationship between that unpopularity and maybe about the purpose of climate protests in the first place, and how that plays into how we look at impact? Because, and sorry, this is another part of the question, which is around the differences between seeking popularity and seeking media attention, for example.
I think one helpful way to look at it is, we recently published a publication with Carnegie Europe about climate activism, and I wrote a chapter about sort of disruptive climate activism in Europe. And there I can put disruptive climate activism into three categories. One is the kind of directly stopping this environmental destruction of the kind of what I call the environmental protest, our previous discussion. So basically, when you directly try to stop something bad, like the opening of a coal mine or the extraction of fossil fuels in the Amazon or whatever. So when you directly seek to intervene, or in very specific cases in Europe, the expansion of a coal mine to destroying a village of Lützerath in Germany that caused big protests, or the building of a huge agro-industrial dam in the south of France, in Saint-Solin, that also caused huge protests. So those are one kind of disruptive protest where you seek to directly stop environmental destruction. Then you have the most mediatized protest, which it basically seeks media attention for its own sake. So this is throwing tomato soup at Van Gogh, or sitting in the road somewhere that doesn't really have any huge connections to the main drivers of climate change. Then you have a protest that seeks to kind of delegitimize the political forces that are producing climate change. So that can be attacking fossil fuel companies or finance banks for campaigning against banks that are funding fossil fuel companies or insuring them, or, aimed at politicians that have links to the fossil fuel industry, or very famous or relevant for me in a university, campaigns against universities to stop having research relationships with fossil fuel companies, museums to stop taking funding from fossil fuel companies, anything like that basically tries to weaken the links between the fossil fuel companies and the rest of society, and basically say that these actors are not legitimate actors, we shouldn't be dealing with them. By doing so, we're kind of greenwashing them or whitewashing them or whatever. We're making them acceptable, which they shouldn't be. So that kind of disruptive protest. And what I say is that the kind of disruptive protest that just seeks media attention, although it's been very effective at getting media attention, it's not very political. It doesn't really have a deeper message more than, let's do something about climate change, or, let's just stop oil. And we found this because we looked at how many people know what Just Stop Oil wanted, and it was like less than 10% that actually could say, although about 70% of the population know about Just Stop Oil, less than 10% could say what their demand was. For those groups that have had a very clear message in their name, such as Insulate Britain, or in Sweden, Återställ våtmarkerna, which are about restoring wetlands, they've actually managed to raise the public understanding about those issues, those specific policy areas. But largely, these groups haven't really changed much in public perception about climate change or fossil fuel extraction and so on. It hasn't turned people for or against in the big questions in the way that the 2019 movement actually did, right? So the 2019 movement actually did shift public opinion towards being concerned about climate change and towards wanting to take action against it.
If you were then advising climate protesters, let's say, on a kind of a magic formula for climate protests, would there be kind of key ingredients then that you think that should be developed? I mean, you're obviously working on thinking about this a lot. So what is a recipe for effectiveness?
I'm really careful to do that because there's so many climate activists out there that are doing fantastic work in very many different ways. But I suppose one thing that I am saying is if you're going to get arrested, do it stop in an oil rig, or do it stop in a coal mine, or something like this kind of worthwhile getting in the papers. In a media that doesn't actually, even though you get in the press, what we found doing the research on this is that the press that increasingly do report, it's shifted through 2023 when we did this research. Towards the end of the year, it was mainly like the Daily Mail and the Sun that were reporting on these protests, which are obviously not sympathetic to the protesters. So the way that it's reported about matters. It was basically suiting the editorial agenda of the right-wing press. It wasn't really achieving anything beneficial for the climate movement.
And where do you think climate protests will move now in terms of other patterns that you're kind of seeing that it may be moving towards?
The kind of climate protest that I also cover in this, the Carnegie piece, it happens all the time, and it often can attract large amounts of activists. And those kind of protests are really worthwhile. I mean, stopping environmental destructive projects or protesting the links between the fossil fuel companies and the rest of society are really worthwhile activities. It might get you into the papers less often, but in and of themselves, these protests are good and worthwhile. And then, of course, in the sense that we need numbers, but nobody has the magic recipe for how to get numbers. And protests go in waves, and they can be triggered by certain events, but that's not to say that if that event was to happen again, then it would definitely trigger large protests. Ultimately, people that have been involved in activism for decades have experienced some of these moments, but they don't necessarily have the recipe for how to bring them about.
Thanks very much to Dr. Oscar Berglund for his time. As usual, we have links to the research mentioned in the podcast, and we also have some of Dr. Berglund's suggested reading on the subject. Do also check out our website where we have new articles and features on climate issues. Thanks also to Vasko Kostovski for audio engineering the show. Bertie will be back in a few weeks' time with another interview. And if you can, you could also like us or give us a review on your podcast platform, as it does really help people find the show. Thanks for listening.